Mafia boss Rafael De Luca had just said the one sentence that made me freeze in the middle of my shift. She refused me? Bring her. In that moment, what made my breath catch wasn't fear. It was the way he was looking at me. That wasn't the gaze of an offended mafia king. It was the look of a man who had just discovered something that belonged to him the very second I turned my back and walked away. I had only said a perfectly normal sentence I'd use with any customer. Please wait your turn. But to him it sounded like a challenge, or worse, a signal. His men closed in on me, but Rafael lifted a hand to stop them. He walked toward me slowly, like he was approaching a secret that might change everything. You ignored me, he said, voice so low and deep my skin went hot. But not to show attitude. So why did you do it? I wanted to snap back, to say I was just doing my job. But my heart skipped a beat when he leaned in, his warm breath brushing my neck. I want to know, he murmured, why you're the one who caught my attention. And in that moment I finally got scared. Not of him, but of the feeling that he had touched my heart before he ever laid a hand on me. I am Lina Torres, and with just one act of ignoring him, I made the most dangerous mafia boss in the city notice me in a way that should never exist. The whole room had gone quiet when Rafael De Luca walked in, right as the dinner rush was hitting its peak. But I had learned long ago that I couldn't afford to stop moving just because someone rich and powerful wanted attention. I had a tray full of bruschetta that was getting cold, and Table 21, a rather impatient group of tourists, was already giving me the look, so I kept my focus on the task in front of me. I know it sounds crazy now, but in that moment, the priority was the crispness of the bread and the perfection of the basil garnish, not the intimidating figure who commanded fear just by breathing. When he lifted that hand, the one with the heavy gold ring, to signal me over, I just kept my back turned and finished arranging the last pieces. My life was small, meticulous, and depended entirely on efficient service, and I wasn't going to let some well-dressed gangster mess up my rotation. I took a deep breath, centered my calm, and then, without even turning my head, I delivered the sentence that felt perfectly normal to me but must have sounded like pure, brazen disrespect to him. I'll come when I'm done. Please wait. The entire kitchen staff seemed to collectively gasp, and I could feel the sudden, sharp silence radiating from Raphael's booth, heavy enough to push on my shoulders. I knew I'd crossed a line, but I carried that tray out of the kitchen anyway, determined to deliver it before I faced the consequences. I set the bruschetta down for the tourists, giving them my most professional, practiced smile, while I was aware of Raphael's second-in-command, Silvio Martel, a man who looked like he was carved out of granite, starting to move. Silvio was wearing a suit that cost more than my entire apartment's rent, and every step he took toward me was slow, deliberate, and entirely predatory. I saw his suit jacket shift just slightly, indicating he was reaching for something inside, and a cold dread, sharp as an ice pick, went straight through me. Silvio didn't stop, but he paused just long enough for his voice to reach me, low and dangerous, like the hiss of a fuse burning down. Do you know who Mr. Raphael is? He asked, the question laced with a menace that was meant to make me tremble. But I couldn't tremble. I was too tired, too focused on holding on to the last shreds of my dignity. I turned to face him, kept my hands neatly folded in front of my apron, and just let him see the calm, almost bored exhaustion in my eyes, the look I reserved for anyone who mistook my service for servitude. I gave him my answer, speaking loud enough for the table of 6 right next to me to hear, which was the final, deliberate act of defiance that sealed my fate. Customers should know how to wait in line. It wasn't a snap judgment. It was a deeply ingrained response to years of being treated like a disposable part of the background. I heard the stifled laughter and the shocked intake of breath from the nearby tables, followed quickly by the nervous, whispering commentary. A woman wearing too much perfume leaned over to her partner, her voice carrying clearly, full of dramatic pity. She's going to die for being stupid. The general consensus in the room was that I was either suicidal or completely ignorant, and either way, I was finished, I braced myself, expecting the shout, the forceful grab, the sudden, violent escalation. But Raphael didn't move violently. He just stood up slowly, deliberately, giving me that cold, unforgettable smile, the one that looked like a promise of something far worse than death, the promise of being utterly and completely seen by the wrong person. He delivered the instruction to his men, the words hitting me with the force of a physical blow, and the entire restaurant fell into a horrified silence. She refused me? Bring her. Now, before I get into the car and tell you what happened next, because trust me, things get so much heavier and more dangerous after this moment, I need to pause for just a second. Hearing that sentence, that command, bring her, felt like the end of everything I knew, a full stop on my quiet, anonymous existence. But standing here today, sharing this with you, I realize it was the beginning of my real life, the moment I stopped being background noise. It's hard to stay grounded when everything is spinning, when you're facing a power structure that doesn't even see you as a person. And I know so many of you have been through those moments where you're just trying to do your job, trying to keep your head above water, and someone with raw, unchecked power just sweeps in and tries to flatten you because you didn't bow fast enough. It means the world to me that you're listening to my story right now, and if you can, just open up your phone for a second. I promise this is quick. Please hit that little like button, leave a comment below telling me something you've been through, something that made you feel small but you kept your dignity anyway, and subscribe to the channel. That simple click helps me keep sharing these stories of heartbreak, of being underestimated, and of finding the strength to stand up. It's a little thing, but it helps me feel like I'm not just talking to the walls. Thank you. Okay, back to the restaurant. The door opened, and the rain started to fall, and I had a feeling that the drizzle was the least of the storms heading my way. Silvio was the one who escorted me out, and the walk from the dining room to the back door felt like crossing an open field under sniper fire. His hand barely touched the small of my back, right at my waist, but the pressure was absolute, guiding me with an economy of movement that was terrifying. He didn't need to grip me. The subtle, heavy weight of his fingers was enough to imply total control, a gesture that spoke volumes about his training and his loyalty. The entire restaurant was paralyzed, every face a snapshot of morbid curiosity and paralyzing fear, and I could practically feel the silent, poisonous judgment pouring off them, contaminating my last moments as a free woman. Look at the little waitress. She thought she was special. Now she's going to pay for it. We moved through the service corridor, past the startled dishwashers, and toward the large metal loading door. Outside, parked right on the curb in the drizzling rain, was a long black limousine, a vehicle so sleek, silent, and intimidating, it looked like it didn't belong to this world. When the heavy door shut behind me, the sound was muffled and absolute, sealing me inside a world I had only read about in bad novels, a space defined by dark, rich leather and the faint, expensive scent of Italian cologne mixed with something else, something metallic and sharp, like the smell of a gun cleaned recently. Raphael was already seated, looking utterly relaxed, sipping from a glass of amber liquid as if this were a Tuesday afternoon tea, not a sudden, violent abduction. He looked completely out of place in my world, yet utterly in control of the one we were now in. He didn't speak immediately. He just watched me, his gaze patient and unnervingly deep, letting the suffocating silence do the work of intimidation. I could feel the subtle movement of the city outside, the distant sirens and the wet hiss of tires on the street. But inside the limo, everything was hermetically sealed, silent, and deeply dangerous. I kept my face blank, reminding myself that being quiet and calm was the only defense I had left, the one small act of control I could maintain. The tension was thick, pressing in on me like the weight of the air-conditioned car, and I finally broke the silence, mostly just to prove to myself that I still had a voice, that I wasn't just a mute hostage. "You wanted me brought in, Mr. DeLuca," I said, making sure my voice was level, almost bored, forcing the air out of my chest. "I'm here. What exactly did I do wrong?" I was doing my job, nothing more. Raphael didn't acknowledge the question or the accusation. He just leaned forward, his elbows resting on his expensive dark wool trousers. His eyes narrowed as he examined me with an intensity that felt surgical, like a scientist looking at a very strange, unexpected specimen. He wasn't interested in my performance review or my work ethic. He cut straight to the core of his immediate, consuming suspicion, his voice low and utterly devoid of any detectable emotion. "Who sent you to watch me?" I blinked, a genuine flicker of disbelief in my expression breaking through my careful composure, which I immediately fought to control. The question was so grand, so completely disconnected from my reality of bussing tables and counting change, that it almost made me laugh out loud, a harsh, unexpected sound that actually made Silvio shift slightly in the driver's seat, his reflection visible in the tinted partition. I kept my chin up, determined not to let him see the fear that was now a cold lump in my stomach, and I met Raphael's gaze, letting him see the bewildered honesty in my eyes, though I knew instinctively that honesty often looked exactly like a sophisticated form of manipulation in his dark world. I let the sheer absurdity of his question hang in the air for a deliberate moment, refusing to rush to a defense before I gave him the simple, pathetic truth, the one that he clearly, fundamentally could not grasp. "I'm a waitress," I said, the corners of my mouth curving slightly in a wry, almost pitiful smile that was totally genuine. "Who in God's name would I be watching? The owner doesn't even trust me to count the spoons at the end of the night, Mr. DeLuca. I work for tips and minimum wage." But he wasn't buying the joke or the humble plea. He was still studying every single reaction, every tiny muscle twitch around my eyes, and I could tell he was actively comparing my unnerving composure to the fear and deference he was accustomed to seeing in the faces of regular civilians. Most people would be weeping, begging for their lives, or screaming hysterically right now. But I wasn't. I was just tired. I was utterly exhausted from being underestimated, and now I was tired of being suspected of being a super spy. My inexplicable calmness, the complete lack of basic civilian panic, was genuinely disturbing him, because it didn't fit the profile of a random, powerless bystander. I kept thinking about my tiny, water-damaged apartment, my meager bank account balance, and the stacks of overdue bills waiting on my worn kitchen table, and I wished he could just see that pathetic, mundane truth. "This is who I am, Mr. DeLuca. Utterly and totally unimportant." He finally sat back against the dark leather, the heavy cushioning sighing beneath his weight, and the immediate, raw intensity eased, replaced by a cold, purely calculating curiosity that was almost worse. He ran a hand slowly over his jaw, a prolonged, thoughtful gesture that pulled my eyes to the hard line of his profile. "You're not a spy," he finally concluded, the words delivered as more of a reluctant observation, a fact that vexed him than an admission of being wrong. "But you're also not afraid. And that, Lena Torres, is a problem for me, a serious political problem." He paused, and I suddenly realized he knew my full name, the sound of it on his tongue sending a cold, sharp chill down my spine. The way he spoke my name, Lena Torres, it wasn't a question, it was a profound statement of ownership, a declaration that from the very second he noticed me, I ceased to be anonymous or untouchable. He reached out and tapped the glass partition, signaling Silvio, letting me know the meeting was over, and I reached for the door handle, ready to run back into the drizzling rain and my desperate, anonymous life. But he stopped me with a voice that was suddenly laced with something sharp and undeniably personal, a promise and a terrifying threat all rolled into one, spoken just as the door was unlatching. "Next time you ignore me," he warned, his eyes locking on mine, "the price will be different, and you will not like it." I didn't ask what he meant. I just gave him a sharp, stiff nod, got out of the car, and walked straight back into the heart of my life, which, as I was about to find out, was already gone, irrevocably destroyed by a single moment of defiance. The fallout was instant and completely devastating, ripping through the quiet fabric of my existence like a shockwave. Before I even had time to finish my shift and collect my meager earnings, the whispers had started. twisting my one act of brave defiance into something ugly and profoundly demeaning. The story wasn't just that I had been seen talking to Raphael DeLuca. It was the narrative everyone immediately layered over it. The pathetic, grasping story they wrote for a woman who was visibly scraping by. A narrative that reduced me to a desperate stereotype. Lena flirted with the Mafia boss to climb up in life. I heard it everywhere, whispered in the coat check, hissed from the kitchen, passed around the break room with gleeful malice. Co-workers, who were perfectly friendly and professional just the day before, now wouldn't even meet my eye, or they'd giggle behind their hands, covering their mouths with their dish towels as I passed by the server station. One of the newer servers, a young woman who always complained about how hard she had to work for every penny, had the sheer audacity to lean in close to me by the bus station, her expression dripping with false pity and genuine envy. And she whispered something that cut me to the bone. "Boss DeLuca would never look at someone like you, Lena. You're not his type. Don't be pathetic. You should know your place." Her words stung, not because I cared about Raphael's romantic interest, but because they stripped me bare, reducing my quiet, hard-earned dignity to a desperate, clawing ambition I never possessed. I just looked at her, let her see that her petty cruelty didn't touch me, and walked away without uttering a single word, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. The real, profound humiliation, the one that cemented my social exile, came just a few days later, right in the middle of a chaotic Saturday brunch service, the day I felt like I was already walking wounded. The restaurant was absolutely packed, the noise level high and aggressive, when Vivian Blake swept in, moving through the crowd with the kind of smooth, unhurried elegance that only comes from knowing your worth is measured in millions. She was a vision of sharp angles and blinding diamonds, with the effortless confidence that radiates from someone who is always the most important person in the room. Vivian was Raphael's very beautiful, very rumored ex-lover, the kind of woman whose pedigree spoke of old money and entitlement, and she didn't even glance at me as she approached my busy section. She didn't have to. She knew exactly where I was standing, knew the precise moment to make her move. She walked right up to the small table I was clearing, waited until I had cleared a stack of heavy, dirty plates, and then, with a casual, almost bored flick of her expensive, manicured wrist, she tossed a thick, rolled-up wad of cash, a shocking amount of money, onto the tablecloth, not even bothering to smooth out the crumpled bills. The money wasn't a tip or a donation. It was a devastating symbol of contempt. She finally looked at me then, her eyes cold, utterly dismissive, and she delivered her line, loud enough for the entire dining room, now unnervingly quiet, to hear. "This is your price, for whatever time you thought you wasted playing the innocent little martyr." It was a moment of profound, calculated public shaming, implying I was a cheap transaction, a momentary distraction that could be paid off and instantly forgotten, and I felt the blood drain from my face, my cheeks burning with a mixture of shame and white-hot fury that threatened to overwhelm me. I didn't touch the money. I just stood there, the stack of dirty plates heavy in my hands, trying to decide if I should throw the plates at her and risk jail, or simply sink into the floor and disappear. Before I could compose a response, before I could deliver the single, quiet sentence that would cut through her elegant cruelty, the owner, a nervous little man named Enzo, rushed over, his face pale and glistening with terror. He didn't dare look at Vivian. He only looked at me, as if I were the one bringing the darkness and the scandal into his otherwise pristine, middle-class restaurant. He nervously shooed Vivian away, his voice shaking with forced respect. "Ms. Blake, please. This is a respectable establishment. We do not conduct business here." Then he turned to me, the fear instantly replaced by a desperate, small man's anger, in a futile attempt to look strong and in charge. "Lena, go home. You're done here. You're dismissed. I can't afford to get involved with the Mafia, and I certainly can't afford the drama that follows you." I knew he was afraid of Vivian, afraid of Raphael, afraid of the entire shadow they cast. But his words still hit me like a physical blow. A sudden, brutal termination. Fired. My single source of income, my steady, quiet, meticulously maintained life, shattered because I told a powerful man to wait his turn. I dropped the stack of plates back onto the table, the clatter echoing the definitive, final break inside me, and just walked straight out the door, leaving the large wad of cash and the utter wreckage of my reputation behind me. Standing in the rain outside, the cold water immediately soaking my thin uniform and plastering the thin cotton to my skin, I felt the sheer, crushing weight of what had happened. I didn't cry. Crying would have been a luxury I couldn't afford, a surrender to the despair that would have crippled me completely. I just stood there, watching the water pool at my worn sneakers, realizing the horrifying truth. One simple act of ignoring had completely ruined my life. Not because Raphael had actually harmed me, but because of what everyone else instantly assumed he would do, or worse, what they assumed a woman like me deserved. The restaurant owner, my petty co-workers, the cruel, elegant Vivian, they all saw me as a blank slate, a nobody from a low-status background who must be desperate for any kind of dangerous attention, a tragic figure looking for a handout. They assumed I must have planned this, orchestrated this little drama for money or power, because a woman like me, an invisible woman, couldn't possibly possess simple, intrinsic, honest dignity. The cold, hard truth settled in my stomach like a rock. Touch the Mafia, even accidentally, and society instantly rejects you, assuming you're contaminated and unworthy of their clean world. I pulled my thin jacket tighter around me, the fabric already heavy with rain, and started walking toward the only place I had left. My tiny two-room apartment, where the only thing waiting for me was crushing silence and the heavy, terrifying reality of unemployment and isolation. The next 2 days blurred into a monotonous cycle of cheap, black coffee and scrolling through job listings that I knew, deep down, I wouldn't get. My phone silent except for the endless stream of automated spam calls. The apartment was small and smelled faintly of old wood, damp plaster, and the cheap vegetable chili I'd cooked the night before. A humble, threadbare space that was now the only boundary between me and the massive, gathering storm I'd inadvertently unleashed. I hadn't even bothered to take down the rain-dampened apron I'd hung over the back of the kitchen chair as a visible reminder of my failure. I was sitting there, nursing a cold cup of coffee and staring blankly at a dead computer screen, when I heard the unmistakable, resonant sound of a heavy, expensive car pulling up outside, the low rumble of its powerful engine vibrating heavily through the worn floorboards of the entire building. I didn't have to look out the window to know exactly who it was. The knock that followed was distinct. 2 sharp, authoritative raps, expecting immediate compliance, completely ignoring the faded doorbell button. I hesitated for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird, before I slowly stood up and walked to the door, feeling like I was walking onto a stage where I hadn't learned any of the necessary lines. I opened it just a crack, ready to tell him to go away, ready to finally, truly stand my ground on my own turf. But the sight of him standing there, massive and completely out of place in my cramped, pathetic hallway, stole the air from my lungs. Raphael DeLuca was standing on my landing, looking utterly unaffected and completely unimpressed by the obvious poverty of my building, as if he carried his own atmosphere and world with him. His suit was immaculate, completely dry despite the continued drizzle, his expression unreadable, and he didn't bother with greetings or any unnecessary pleasantries. He just looked past me into the apartment, his eyes quickly scanning the cheap furniture and the clutter, confirming the humbling reality of my life. The complete lack of any secret high-tech equipment, hidden safes, or signs of wealth. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, the sheer, overpowering force of his presence instantly filling the tiny space and seemingly pushing all the breathable air out. I closed the door behind him, my back pressed hard against the wood, effectively trapping myself between him and the outside world. He looked pointedly at the damp apron still hanging on the kitchen chair, and then back at me. A flicker of something almost like reluctant acceptance, or perhaps a strange form of guilt crossing his features. He cut straight to the point, as always, his voice losing that initial, cold curiosity. sounding instead like a man deeply frustrated by a political error. "You're not a spy," he stated bluntly, the words sounding heavy, as if the sheer, humbling realization of that fact cost him a great deal of his professional pride. He explained the situation quickly and efficiently, laying out the timeline like a forensic report. He hadn't been able to reconcile why a professional spy would act so brazenly, so without fear, and that fundamental inconsistency bothered him. It felt like a misdirect, so he had his people check all the security footage, not just of the restaurant, but of the surrounding streets and the traffic cameras. And it turned out the restaurant's entire local CCTV system had been briefly and cleanly hacked. A professional, momentary insertion of technical noise exactly at the moment he walked in. The attention he paid to me, my defiant act, was a clever mistake. A brilliant distraction designed to make him look paranoid and arrogant, wasting his organization's resources investigating a simple, defiant waitress while the real threat, the real search for a target, went completely unnoticed. He realized I was nothing more than a pawn, a perfectly honest woman whose simple, low-status dignity had been expertly weaponized against him, and the insult of that deception seemed to genuinely offend him. Not on my behalf, but on the behalf of the clean efficiency of the deceit. "They used you to make me look foolish, Lena," he said, the quiet anger now palpable, directed entirely at his shadowy enemies, not at me. "They took your livelihood because they knew I would notice your strange defiance, and they knew my people would instantly assume you were guilty of something bigger." He took a step closer, and I instinctively braced myself against the wall, but he didn't move to touch me. Instead, he made the strangest, most compelling offer I had ever heard. "Work for me for 30 days, he commanded, looking at me with absolute, unwavering certainty. "I will use you to expose the real threat, and I will restore everything that has been unjustly taken from you, and then some." I felt a sudden, fierce burst of moral indignation, the kind that only comes when you feel your deepest value is being profoundly misunderstood. I shook my head immediately, taking a step back until my shoulders hit the wall, utterly opposed to the idea of being bought. "No one can buy me, Mr. DeLuca," I told him, my voice firm and low, rejecting the implied transaction. "My integrity is not for sale, and I won't be a trophy." Raphael's eyes flared suddenly with something entirely new, something that looked strikingly close to respect, a profound, fleeting expression that softened his harsh, dangerous features for a split second. He didn't argue with my principle or try to minimize my integrity. He simply corrected my transactional assumption, reframing the offer. "I'm not buying you, Lena," he said, his voice dropping to a persuasive, almost intimate murmur, forcing me to listen. "I'm hiring what you can do. You noticed a situation I did not. You remained disturbingly calm under a kind of pressure I can't even imagine most people facing. Your defiance, your innate composure, your quiet observation. That is a genuine strength. I need to know why you weren't afraid, and I need someone close to me who is simply, stubbornly not afraid." Before I could counter that, before I could ask what kind of job he actually had in mind for a displaced waitress, Silvio suddenly appeared, materializing silently in the doorway like a shadow, his face etched with sharp, undeniable disapproval and apprehension. He didn't address me. He only spoke to Raphael, his tone grave, heavy, and intensely urgent. A desperate warning meant only for his boss. "Boss, this girl is an unknown variable. She has no loyalty to us. She only has pride. She could destroy you and everything you've built." Raphael merely waved his hand, a heavy, dismissive gesture that instantly cut Silvio's protest short. But the words hung heavy and thick in the air between us. A prophecy I knew, deep down, might very well be true. I didn't want to destroy him, but I sure as hell didn't want to be destroyed by him either. So, I took a deep, steadying breath, met his gaze, and against every instinct I had, I accepted his dangerously strange deal. My new job turned out to be less of a job and more of an extended, terrifying, and profoundly humiliating audition for a role I never wanted. I wasn't cooking, I wasn't serving. I was simply there. required to observe and exist. I was forced to become his constant shadow, meant to observe, meant to sit quietly and simply exist in the background. A low-status woman in a high-stakes, hyper-masculine world, acting as a kind of silent, emotional barometer for the people who surrounded him. The first real assignment was attending a closed-door, clandestine meeting of the Italian Mafia bosses, an ancient, serious ritual of power, loyalty tests, and veiled threats, held in a ridiculously ornate, old-world room that looked like it belonged in a heavily guarded European museum. I was wearing one of Raphael's sister's dresses, a simple, unadorned black shift that was the quietest thing in the entire room. But even so, I stuck out immediately, looking painfully obvious, like a completely misplaced piece of cheap furniture amidst priceless antiques. As soon as I walked in behind Raphael, clinging to his shadow, the low, poisonous whispering started, a malicious hum that went straight to my ears, designed to wound and dismiss. "He's lost all his standards, bringing a waitress to the table," one heavy-set older boss muttered, adjusting the silk handkerchief spilling from his breast pocket, his contempt entirely visible. I felt my cheeks flush crimson, but I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, focused intently on the detailed carvings on the far wall, just trying to breathe through the sheer, collective force of the humiliation they were pouring over me. Then another boss, a man with a charming, deceptive smile and disturbingly cruel, empty eyes, decided to escalate the public shaming, making a show of it just as Raphael sat down at the head of the immense mahogany table. He didn't address me directly, of course. He only spoke directly to Raphael, his voice thick with mocking insinuation and loud enough to ensure the entire assembly heard every syllable of his insult. "Raphael, my dear friend, are you planning to crown this little thing your queen already? Or is this just a cheap little trophy you picked up on the street? My compliments on your taste for the humble and easily disposable." The words were brutally designed to emasculate Raphael politically and to absolutely crush me personally, instantly reducing me to a cheap, replaceable prop, a discarded doll he'd brought along for show. I could feel all their collective eyes boring into me, measuring my worth. Deciding exactly how quickly I would break under the pressure, I wanted fiercely to lash out, to defend myself with the sharp, cutting words I usually held back. But I remembered Raphael's stern instructions. Observe. Do not react. Let them think you are unimportant. So I didn't. I simply lowered my gaze, clasped my hands loosely in front of me, and settled deep into the role they had assigned me, deciding in that instant that I would use their arrogant assumptions about my low status against them, letting them believe I was too stupid or too cowed to fully understand the intricate layers of their insults. The most profound, calculated act of cruelty came, unsurprisingly, from Vivian, who was present at the meeting, seated at a separate, smaller table, maintaining a chilly, elegant distance from the central conflict. She clearly hadn't forgotten the scene at the restaurant, and she was incandescently furious that I was still breathing the same air as Raphael, let alone standing at his side, during a tense, high-stakes moment in the meeting, when all eyes were momentarily fixed on a heated debate over a financial dispute. She stood up abruptly, ostentatious,ly ostensibly to refill her glass from a crystal decanter. She walked past my chair, and as she passed, her elbow swung out with a practiced, casual grace, a subtle movement that knocked her nearly full glass of expensive, deep red Chianti right across my chest. It wasn't a clumsy accident. It was a calculated, vicious act of public cruelty, designed to ruin the borrowed dress and loudly remind everyone present, including me, that I was disposable, a stain easily wiped away. The wine spread across the simple black fabric instantly, blooming quickly into a massive dark patch that looked sickeningly like a fresh, physical wound. Vivian barely paused her stride, offering a saccharine, meaningless apology with a cold smile. "Oh, my dear, how frightfully clumsy of me. I suppose that's the kind of thing one simply gets used to, isn't it, when one spends time in less than respectable places?" The room went completely silent again, every head turning, every man waiting for Raphael to finally act, to defend me, to show that I was, in fact, worth more than a ruined dress and a cheap insult. But Raphael did nothing at all. He didn't even glance in my direction. He kept his eyes locked on the boss who was currently talking, his face a perfect mask of impenetrable focus and cold, rigid indifference. He had explicitly told me he couldn't risk choosing sides or showing a weakness until he knew precisely who the real, deep-rooted traitor was. And in that long, agonizing moment, I understood he meant it literally. He was using me as the ultimate bait, a living, breathing litmus test for his rivals, and he would sacrifice my public dignity, and maybe even risk my life, just to flush out the snake in his inner circle. The wine stain was spreading, heavy, sticky, and sickeningly warm on my chest, and I felt the profound sting of his political betrayal in the silence. It wasn't the cheap, public display of the spilled wine that hurt the most. It was the sharp, internal pain of knowing that he let them do it, standing by silently while I was brutally humiliated, making me feel like nothing more than a convenient prop, a discarded, stained doll he'd brought along for a show. I didn't cry then. I didn't shout or draw attention. I just quietly excused myself, whispered a polite, firm word to Silvio, and walked with quiet dignity to the nearest marble-lined bathroom, finding a rough, clean towel and pressing it hard against the stain, holding myself together until the tense meeting was finally over. The echoing silence of the palatial bathroom, a temporary, fragile shield against the hostile, waiting world outside. It was during that desperate, private cleanup that the crucial, pivotal shift occurred. I was dabbing frantically at the ruined dress, running cold water over the wine stain in a futile effort, when I noticed something glinting on Vivian's wrist as she stepped up to the sink, completely oblivious to me, to reapply her perfect red lipstick. She was wearing a thick, antique-looking silver bracelet, something heavily detailed and out of place among her otherwise sleek, modern jewelry. My breath caught sharply in my throat. It was just a small, intricate, etched symbol on the clasp, almost completely hidden by the ornate metalwork. But I recognized it instantly. A sudden, blinding flash of realization. I didn't know why I recognized it, but the image of that specific stylized bird's wing with a subtle, broken crest immediately triggered a vivid memory from my impoverished childhood, something I'd seen years ago, pinned to a scrap of old paper in a dusty, forgotten corner of a dilapidated bookstore, labeled in elegant, foreign script with a name I now remembered, Volkov. That specific, precise design was the stylized family crest of Kazimir Volkov, the ruthless Russian Mafia boss, Raphael's most powerful and bloodthirsty enemy. The full realization hit me with the force of a train. Vivian, the scorned ex-lover, the picture of Italian elegance, was secretly and lethally connected to Raphael's most potent rival. The wine spill hadn't been a petty act of jealousy. It had been a calculated, brilliant distraction, a way to shame me while simultaneously distracting attention from her own treacherous hand. That night, after the exhausting meeting finally dispersed, I couldn't sleep a wink. The horrifying image of the bracelet kept burning like a brand in my mind, the wine stain on the dress now forgotten in the face of this immense danger. I was sitting quietly in the corner of Raphael's massive, intimidating library, pretending to read a thick, heavy book I couldn't possibly focus on, when I heard low, muffled voices coming from the next room, separated only by a sliding pocket door that was slightly ajar. It was Vivian and one of the other bosses, the one with the cruel, smiling eyes, and their voices were low, conspiratorial, and their intent was terrifyingly clear. I moved silently to the thin, polished wood of the door, pressing my ear hard against the cold mahogany, and I didn't manage to hear the full, intricate plan, but I caught a single, crucial, terrifying phrase that made my blood run cold. "Lure Raphael out of his territory. The drop is set for tomorrow night, near the docks." They were coordinating the final, lethal move, and Vivian was the inside woman, the serpent in his own garden. The betrayal was real, imminent, and it was happening now. I felt a wave of icy, profound clarity wash over me, completely clearing away the self-pity and fear. I wasn't a waitress, and I wasn't just a discarded doll. I was, inexplicably, the only person in Raphael's entire organization who knew the actual, deadly truth. And I was the only person who had been profoundly underestimated enough to see it hidden in plain sight. I stood up, walked out of the library, the unread book still clutched tightly in my hand, and went straight to Raphael's imposing office, my feet silent on the thick carpet. The quiet dignity of my walk suddenly infused with a new, deadly purpose. He was sitting at his massive, highly organized desk, drinking dark whiskey, his tie loosened, looking exhausted, defeated and deeply grim, completely consumed by the political fallout and the lingering sense of betrayal. He glanced up, genuinely surprised to see me, and I walked right up to the desk, slamming the heavy book down onto the polished surface with a loud, definitive thud, instantly forgetting all the rules he had given me about staying silent and maintaining my composure. The quiet had finally left me, replaced by a fierce, protective rage. I was shaking with fury, not because of the humiliation I'd suffered, but at the deadly trap he was stupidly walking into. I leaned hard over his desk, my hands braced on the cool, unforgiving wood, meeting his stunned gaze with an intensity I didn't know I possessed. A fierce, unwavering commitment. "Vivian is the traitor," I declared, my voice low, raw, and fiercely determined. "She's actively working with Casimir Volkov. She is wearing his family crest on that disgusting silver bracelet, and I just overheard her talking about luring you out of your territory tomorrow night near the docks. It's a setup, a clean execution." He didn't immediately dismiss me or question my sanity. His eyes were wide, genuinely shocked by the absolute certainty and the raw conviction in my voice. I could see the analytical wheels turning, the calculations starting, and I didn't give him a chance to start formulating a defensive plan before I delivered my ultimatum, the one I'd meticulously crafted during those long, lonely hours of painful humiliation. "If I successfully save you from this trap," I told him, making sure every single word was heavy with meaning and utterly non-negotiable, "you stop treating me like an object, you stop using me as silent bait, you start seeing me as a person, a partner, or I walk away right now, this very minute, and you can deal with Vivian and Volkov yourself, with all your blind spots intact." The silence that followed was total, deafening, broken only by the faint, slow drip of ice melting in his abandoned glass. No one, absolutely no one in his universe, had ever dared to bargain with Raphael De Luca, certainly not a waitress he had employed for barely a month, and especially not over the terms of their professional relationship. He looked at me, really looked at me this time, his sharp eyes finally seeing beyond the clothes and the lack of status, and I could tell he was frantically assessing the enormous cost of my demands against the fatal price of the betrayal I had just exposed. He was clearly stunned, not by the sheer audacity of my request, but by the profoundly strange fact that I was bargaining for abstract respect and personal recognition, not for money, jewels, or personal safety. He studied me for a long, heavy moment, and then a slow, dangerous, terrifying smile finally crept across his face, a smile that didn't yet reach his eyes but acknowledged the profound power of my move. "Deal," he whispered, his voice dark, serious, and utterly committed, sealing the most dangerous contract of my life right there, in the middle of his office. With the incredibly specific intel I provided, Raphael was able to instantly uncover the full, intricate breadth of Vivian's deception, using the information I gave him to quickly trace the coded communications and the secret meeting points, instantly confirming that the elegant ex-lover, the one who tried to pay me off like a prostitute, was indeed the true, lethal snake in his inner circle. He instantly realized that my unique perception, my almost obsessive ability to notice the small, out-of-place detail like that specific crest, was a razor-sharp, essential weapon he desperately lacked, a kind of vision his powerful men had lost. I may have been socially powerless, but I saw what the rich and powerful always missed. The trap for Raphael was meticulously set, but it was Vivian who walked right into a cage of his design, her carefully laid, elegant plot unraveling instantly when the men she expected to greet her at the docks turned out to be Raphael's most loyal, silent enforcers, led by a grim-faced and completely unsmiling Silvio. The public scandal was immediate and total. The elegant Ms. Blake, the darling of the society pages, was publicly revealed to be a cold, calculating double agent, working for the most feared Russian mobster in the region. But the political fallout for Raphael, who had just been saved by his waitress, was only just beginning, and my highly visible involvement, now completely undeniable, had painted a massive, glaring target on his back. The immense relief that the traitor was caught and neutralized was quickly overshadowed by the deafening whispers of the other, more traditional Mafia families. Rumors, fast, furious, and highly critical, began to swirl through the city's entire underworld. Boss DeLuca is about to fall because of a woman. He is weak. They weren't whispering about the treacherous Vivian. They were whispering solely about me. I was immediately designated as the new, profound weakness, the illogical, emotional choice that had dangerously diverted his professional attention and almost cost him his empire and his life. I had become the public symbol of his vulnerability, the visible chink in his armor, and they despised me and him for it. The political pressure mounted in ways that were suffocating and incredibly hard to fight. Far beyond just harsh words, allies, powerful men who had stood loyally by Raphael for decades, began to subtly distance themselves, sending polite but firmly worded warnings through carefully chosen intermediaries. The messages were always the same, cold and delivered without emotion. If you keep her, we walk away from you. This is an untenable risk. They all saw me as the ultimate risk factor, the stain on his professional, ruthless image, and they simply couldn't accept that the most feared, ruthless man in the city would actually risk everything: his power, his safety, his tradition, for a woman he'd just met, especially one who clearly came from nowhere. One afternoon, Silvio, who still maintained a cold, professional distance from me, pulled me aside in a long, dim hallway, his expression heavier, more conflicted, and genuinely sadder than I'd ever seen it before. He didn't threaten me this time. He simply laid out the cold, hard, unyielding rules of their world, not as a moral judgment, but as a dire, undeniable statement of fact. "Lena," he said, his voice quiet, looking me straight in the eye with immense pity. "In this world, absolute love equals inevitable death. It always has. It is a fatal weakness they will exploit with surgical precision, and it'll be your throat they cut first to get to him." His stark honesty chilled me to the bone, forcing me to fully confront the grim, lethal reality of what this sudden, intense connection truly meant. His dire warning, coupled with the increasing, almost tangible hostility radiating from all corners of the organization, made me question everything, especially the depth and sincerity of Raphael's feelings for me. Was this just genuine respect? Was it pity for the way I was treated? Or was it merely a dangerous, possessive infatuation, a brief anomaly that would inevitably kill us both? I watched him constantly, searching his harsh, impenetrable face for any kind of answer. But he remained an enigma, focused only on consolidating his recently threatened power and dealing with the massive political aftermath of Vivian's treason. Then, the anonymous final letter arrived, designed to break my resolve. It was delivered by an anonymous courier, slipped silently under the door of Raphael's highly secure compound, and I found it tucked into the pocket of my borrowed jacket, a heavy, cold weight. The paper was heavy, expensive, and the message was typed, concise and utterly terrifying in its cold logic. "Wanna live? Leave Raphael. Tonight." It was the final, clearest threat, designed to make me break, to make me run, to prove that his political enemies were right, that I was the easily intimidated, weak civilian who would ultimately choose her own simple survival over any loyalty to his dangerous world. I stared at the note, my heart aching with the grim, terrible realization that this love, if that's what it was, had already branded me with a death sentence, and that I might very well have to pay the ultimate, final price for his choice to protect me. The demand for my immediate and total removal came to a violent, definitive head at a major council meeting, the largest, most tense gathering of the city's major crime families in a decade. The atmosphere was thick with simmering resentment, palpable fear, and aggressive anticipation, everyone waiting for Raphael to either finally cave to the immense political pressure or declare open war on his own most powerful allies. I was standing quietly in a far corner, wearing the same simple black dress, now spotlessly cleaned and meticulously pressed, a visible, defiant reminder of the earlier humiliation, a silent act of utter refusal to be broken. The massive, intimidating room was packed with powerful men, and they were all glaring at me with undisguised, profound contempt. One by one, the older, more traditional bosses stood up and spoke, their arguments logical, relentless, and brutally effective. They demanded that Raphael get rid of me, explaining, with cold reason, that tradition, security, and the stability of the entire organization required him to sacrifice the emotional, public vulnerability I represented. They weren't explicitly talking about killing me, not yet, but about banishing me, sending me away so far and so permanently that I could never compromise his power base again. They saw me as the ultimate political liability, an unnecessary, illogical complication in a dark world that thrived on clean, sharp, ruthless lines. I watched Raphael from across the vast, heavy room, my stomach tight with a crushing dread, entirely convinced that the sheer, overwhelming pressure would finally be too much, that he would inevitably choose the huge, imposing empire he had so ruthlessly built over the woman who had only been in his life for a terrifying 30 days. He listened patiently, his hands folded neatly on the polished table, his expression completely impassive, letting them air all their desperate grievances and self-serving demands, letting the tension coil tighter and tighter in the room until it was almost unbearable. When the last boss finally finished speaking, the silence returned, heavier and infinitely more expectant than before. Then slowly, deliberately, Raphael rose from his chair, a massive, powerful presence. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't deliver a dramatic speech about honor or a sentimental declaration of love. He simply walked, slowly and purposefully, toward me. The entire room following his every movement, every single eye focused intently on our small, isolated corner. He reached out, his large, warm hand enveloping mine completely, and he pulled me, gently but firmly, to stand right beside him, directly in front of the council table, positioning me squarely in the center of the political and physical conflict. He didn't lean on me for support, and I didn't lean on him. We stood side by side, two separate, defiant people facing a unified, hostile threat. And in that instant, I felt the connection between us solidify into something hard, unbreakable, and intensely real. He looked out at the faces of his most powerful enemies, his calculating allies, and the undecided neutral men, and he spoke, his voice low, steady, and utterly final, a declaration that echoed the very first moment we met in the restaurant. "She refused me once," he said, the words cutting through the air like sharp glass, acknowledging the very first act of my defiance that had started all this. Then he paused, letting that profound truth settle, before he delivered the line that instantly changed the power structure of the entire room, a final, unyielding choice. "I refuse all of you now." He wasn't threatening them. He was simply choosing a dangerous new path. He declared, without a trace of hesitation, that anyone who even contemplated touching me, banishing me, or hurting me in any way would be instantly declaring immediate and total war on him and everything he controlled. He wasn't relying on their fear alone. He was relying on the terrifying clarity of the cold, hard choice he'd just made. The air seemed to crackle with silent, hostile shock and disbelief. Then, without a single word of further warning or explanation, in front of the entire underworld, he cupped my face roughly in his hand and kissed me. A long, deep, possessive, undeniable kiss that wasn't just for me, but for them. A visible, undeniable statement that he had irrevocably chosen the dangerous path of chaos and genuine, raw feeling. and he would absolutely never look back. The consequence of his audacious choice was terrifyingly swift and brutally decisive. Within 48 hours of that shocking public kiss, I was violently kidnapped. It happened late one cold evening, outside a meeting where Raphael had reluctantly left me with Silvio to attend to a small, contained skirmish. A deliberate, tactical choice by Kazimir Volkov to exploit the brief, known moment of separation. I was violently yanked into the back of a black, unmarked van by men whose faces I never saw. The roughness of their hands a terrifying shock after the measured, careful control of Raphael's world. They drove me deep into the abandoned industrial outskirts of the city, to a vast, dilapidated, empty warehouse that smelled strongly of dust, stale chemicals, and pure, concentrated fear. And I was tied securely to a single, cold metal chair in the exact center of the immense, echoing space. Kazimir Volkov himself finally walked in, looking like a terrifying, massive caricature of cold, dead power, with eyes that held the frightening deadness of old, gray snow. He didn't waste a single moment on pleasantries or negotiation. He simply set up a small camera on a tripod, testing the connection, making it chillingly clear that this was not going to be a private or quiet negotiation. Kazimier's grim-faced men quickly established a high-quality live-stream connection, the video feed directed straight to Raphael's known headquarters. I could vividly imagine the white-hot fear and pure, focused fury on Raphael's face as he watched this live scene unfold. And that thought, more than the fear for my own immediate safety, was what finally broke my emotional resolve. Kazimir leaned in close, his massive, cold hand resting heavily on my shoulder, his voice a low, gravelly, repulsive threat directed solely at the unseen screen. "Choose, DeLuca," he hissed, his breath hot and utterly repulsive against my ear. "Your entire empire or the girl. Give up your northern territory and she lives. Keep the territory and she dies right now, live on camera." The horrifying words hit me, but it was the deep shame and the utter exhaustion of being used as a disposable pawn, yet again, that finally broke me completely. I started to cry then, silent, desperate, miserable tears of humiliation and utter despair, entirely convinced that this was the natural, inevitable end. Raphael would absolutely choose power, and he should. He has to choose his life's work, I thought, the realization crushing me. He's a boss. He has massive responsibilities. He can't choose a waitress over his life's work, over the safety of his entire family. Kazimir saw the tears, saw my profound despair and acceptance, and gave a cruel, cold, knowing smile to the camera. "Mafia love always kills, little bird," he hissed, deliberately pulling the thin, sharp blade of his knife just slightly across my cheek, a small, visible, sickening cut for the camera feed. In that darkest moment, I closed my eyes and completely accepted it. The fatal price of being seen and chosen by Raphael was death, and I was finally ready to pay it. Resolved not to beg or plead, but simply to quietly accept the fatal outcome of a dangerous choice I should have never made. The moment stretched into an unbearable, terrifying eternity. The heavy silence of the massive warehouse broken only by the low, constant hum of the camera and the sound of my own ragged, desperate breathing. Then, through the heavy, bolted metal door, a sound ripped violently through the stillness. A single, massive, metallic crash, followed immediately by the frantic, echoing sound of highly disciplined automatic gunfire. It wasn't a negotiation or a cautious infiltration. It was an absolute, singular invasion. Raphael had arrived, and he hadn't brought his entire coordinated army. He'd come alone, relying solely on the element of utter surprise and his own brutal, focused efficiency. The doors burst violently open, torn from their hinges, and he stood framed momentarily in the doorway, his expensive suit already torn, blood visible on his white collar, his face a mask of primal, focused, terrifying rage. He wasn't looking at Kazimir's scattered men. He wasn't looking at the camera recording his humiliation. He was only intensely looking at me. He walked straight through the barrage of incoming gunfire, moving with a desperate, singular focus, ignoring the bullets whizzing past him, his attention laser-focused only on the metal chair I was tied to, his eyes burning with a desperate, frantic intensity I'd never witnessed before. He threw himself violently over the nearest table, using the heavy wood as a momentary shield, and he didn't stop his desperate charge until he was standing directly in front of me, taking the entire focus of the threat onto himself. Casimir's voice boomed, shocked, furious, and filled with a desperate disbelief. "You chose the girl? You chose the girl over everything? Are you mad?" Raphael didn't answer him. He was breathing heavily, his entire focus consumed by the action, his eyes still locked intensely on mine. But just as he reached to quickly saw through the thick ropes on my hands, a sharp, metallic thud was heard, and a fresh bullet slammed brutally into his side. He gasped, a guttural, raw sound of pain, but instead of falling or retreating, he just threw himself violently forward, wrapping his massive, powerful body around the chair, shielding me completely from the renewed, terrifying barrage of bullets. The pain must have been absolutely immense, crippling, but he held me tight, his body shuddering with the impact, and he spoke the one line that instantly silenced the entire, bloody, echoing room. A final confession and a promise all in one. She refused me, and I still chose her. That was all he needed to say. It was the simple, brutal truth of our story, a complete rejection of their rules, and it was powerfully enough. In that flash of agonizing, desperate clarity, with Raphael's wounded body shielding mine, I saw the discarded gun lying on the rough concrete floor, dropped by one of Casimir's fallen men, just inches from the tip of my worn boot. With Raphael's immense weight crushing me, his sharp, raw pain transferring through the fabric of his torn suit, I didn't have time to think. I simply acted on pure, desperate instinct. I strained violently, twisting my bound hands until the rough rope cut deeply into my skin, and then, using the last of my adrenaline-fueled strength, I kicked out my foot, snagging the gun's heavy handle and dragging it quickly back toward the chair. I fumbled desperately, my bound fingers clumsy and numb. But I managed to get the gun clutched tightly between my hands, my aim directed purely by instinct and rage, straight at Casimir, who stood watching the scene, stunned into temporary paralysis by the unfolding chaos and violence. He was finally raising his own large weapon, a triumphant, cruel sneer returning to his face, utterly convinced that Raphael's ridiculous choice had cost him everything. But before he could fire again, I squeezed the trigger with all my might. The sound was deafening, concussive, the kickback immense, and I saw Casimir stagger violently back, a look of pure, bewildered, agonizing shock on his face. Before he fell heavily to the cold, concrete floor, the threat finally neutralized. It was the first time I had ever fired a gun, the very first time I had ever actively fought and killed for Raphael. And in that moment, I wasn't a waitress, I wasn't a pawn, I was his complete and deadly equal in the fight. Silence descended rapidly, absolute and heavy, broken only by the sound of Raphael's shallow, ragged breathing and the distant screams of sirens approaching. His men, alerted by the continuous gunfire, finally burst in, securing the area quickly. But their presence was utterly irrelevant now. Raphael was still tightly draped over me, his massive body trembling with shock and pain. But his grip was fiercely protective, utterly refusing to let go. I was the one who finally managed to free my hands from the cut ropes, and I immediately placed them firmly against the massive, slick wound in his side, trying to staunch the overwhelming rush of blood, my hands shaking uncontrollably, now that the terrifying adrenaline was quickly fading. He pulled his head back, his eyes hazy, glazed over with immense pain, and looked directly at me. A soft, weary, profoundly beautiful smile touching his lips. He ignored the men, the chaos, the victory, the danger. He only spoke to me, his voice a strained, dry rasp, but his words clear, final, and definitively defining everything we were and everything we would become. "You're not mine because I brought you," he whispered, pulling me into a desperate, tight embrace, a mixture of hot blood, intense relief, and utter exhaustion. "You're mine because you stayed and fought." He hadn't bought me, He hadn't commanded me. He had simply chosen me completely, and I had chosen him back. Not by saying a simple yes, but by fighting violently and ruthlessly beside him, proving that my ultimate strength was not found in ignoring him, but in choosing to stand and fight in the most dangerous, terrifying room in the world. He recovered, of course, slowly and painfully, but completely. Men like Rafael de Luca, with that kind of pure, focused will, always managed to recover. But he was never, ever the same, and neither profoundly was I. The inevitable fallout for those who had wronged us was clean, public, and brutally decisive. Vivian faced the swift, cold judgment of Raphael's revitalized organization, a far harsher, more final fate than anything I could have ever wished on her. And Kazimir Volkov's public, high-profile assassination sent a massive shockwave that corrected the entire balance of power, solidifying Raphael's position, paradoxically, because of the emotional, personal choice he had so publicly made. I never once gloated. I never lingered on the victory. I just stood silently beside him, no longer as his anonymous shadow, but as his undeniable partner, his equal, my quiet strength now recognized and respected as a tangible power in its own right. The woman who was disastrously underestimated until she had no other choice but to fight for everything she was. I never went back to waitressing, not even to visit the restaurant. But I never became a socialite either. I became something else entirely. I became his clarity, the quiet, unwavering, grounded center of his impossibly chaotic, dangerous world. It turns out, you don't actually need status or wealth to command profound, lasting respect. You just need to be exactly, fearlessly who you are, without any apology or explanation. You need to fiercely hold your ground, even when the entire hostile world is screaming at you to run away and hide. You need to absolutely refuse to be defined by anyone else's pathetic assumptions about your worth. You need to know, deep in your soul, that your dignity is the only thing they can't buy, and the one thing they can never, ever take away. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below, and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.